and welcome to this episode of Psych Attack. I'm Dr. Jasmine B. MacDonald. Today, I have the pleasure of catching up with Dr. Will Dobud. This is the third time we're catching up for Psych Attack. The first time, Will joined me to discuss outdoor and adventure therapies, and then we caught up again to discuss his book called Kids These Days. Kids These Days is currently on pre-sale and is being released in late September, so you should absolutely go to the pre-sale page and register for that one or put your order in. And if you haven't listened to those previous episodes, please do yourself a favor and go back and check those out. So this time around, I've asked Will to come and have a talk to me about his experience of writing and publishing a non-fiction book. A kind of lessons learnt kind of a chat. Rather than sharing insights from the book content, which you can hear in another episode, I want to really talk to Will about mechanics, processes, and experiences behind bringing together a non-fiction and mental health focused book. As always, I am using Psych Attack partly to share cool information, but also to learn stuff myself. So this is not completely altruistic. Thanks for coming back to Psych Attack, Will.
Third time lucky. I'm very ready.
While we're not going to focus so much on the content of the book Kids These Days, maybe it's useful to just give a little bit of background of the book and what you're focusing on as context for the chat that we're going to have.
Sure. So basically, the process of the book was we simply asked a group of experts in their respective fields, what's going on with kids these days? You know, we hear on the news that there's a mental health crisis. What's really going on? And what we found is that depending on the lane that somebody comes from, their description of what's going on is totally different than somebody else's, which leads to different kind of solutions. So we just kind of zoomed out and thought of how can we talk about youth mental health in a way that tries to cover as much as we could without obviously being totally exhaustive of the whole thing.
Yeah, nice one. I don't think we tapped into this in the last episode on the book, but I'm wondering, what are the personal drivers for you to create a book?
There's a few of them. And speaking to like being altruistic or not, like sometimes you write something and you go, this is something I really want to share with everybody. And I like this topic and I think I have a story to share, which is a weird thing to sit with because it means you think you have something other people care about. And for the most part, the majority of people probably don't care what you have to say. So you have to sit with, I'm doing this for other people while knowing no one's going to read this, right? I think a lot of that comes from growing up as a musician and growing up in playing in punk bands where you can make the coolest, most punk rock flyer. No one's coming to your show. And so then you have to fall in love with performing to nobody. I think when I have something stuck in my brain and being someone who at a young age was diagnosed with ADHD and I can struggle falling to sleep, I'm very good at staying asleep, but falling asleep, I'll go, well, I haven't thought about that. The process of writing is quite cathartic to get things out of my brain. And so I do love writing and I loved the opportunity to write with my friend Nevin, who's been a mentor and good friend of mine for many years. But at the same time, to try writing in a different style, to write not necessarily in APA referencing and have to write a positionality statement and your methods and your limitations and this and that, to write in a more freeing sort of way.
And was that as free or as ideal as you'd imagined it would be?
It was really freeing. One of my passions if I'm writing a peer-reviewed article or sharing something from the world of peer review, you can throw around terms like, well, the first meta-analysis of psychotherapy really cemented that psychotherapy works. What that means to someone who doesn't know what a meta-analysis is nothing. And so I often think if I can really make it simple enough that a 10-year-old could understand it, I'm probably writing really well. It was really freeing to be able to touch on topics that I was not an expert in, kind of zooming in a lot, I think is where I like to really learn about something. So it was fulfilling. It was also hard knowing my audience for kids these days is not the academic world. It's not
Mm.
people who agree with me. It could be people that really fundamentally disagree with me. And so how do I at least make that fun and not come across like a giant asshole?
Mm. It's a pretty tough space, especially writing with part of the audience being parents.
Mhm.
Of there can be a resistance. Sometimes I've found this with work that we've written in my current role. You know, you need to be conscious of not telling parents their job or what's expected of them while still trying to provide useful information. Was that something that you were kind of struggling with in writing the work?
One of the things we acknowledged at the start was that there are too many parenting books, right?
Mm.
So you have, for instance, two big bestsellers in the last 10 years. And the last 10 years was called the Decade of the Parenting Manual, right? So you have Amy Chua's The Tiger Mom, right? Be ruthless, be all over, make sure your kid's doing this, make sure all responsibility. And then you have like Lenore Skenesi's Free Range Kids. Let your kids go out and do whatever. Both of them got absolutely eviscerated and both of them got absolutely praised.
Yeah.
So instead of saying there's one way to do this, we tried to present it from all circles. This is probably a horrible, not horrible in a bad way, but kind of a funny way to think about it. I grew up as South Park was emerging, right? And South Park does things as comedic writers that show a side of the story that you go, "Oh my gosh, that's a horrible thing to say." But if you give it 30 seconds, they go full circle around a topic where the whole episode you see every viewpoint of one thing. And I think that a good way if you're writing nonfiction, and my PhD supervisor, John Healy, taught me this. If you know what the critique is that's going to happen in what you write, if you in group work, old school adventure therapy, group worky stuff, probably all group work, it's called front loading, where you might say, some people might feel offended by this, but here's what we found in our research. You're kind of telling someone, we know this might be hard to read.
Mm.
So instead of going, no, we found this and you need to not be offended by what we wrote, you're kind of showing all sides of what the critique could be. And I
Yeah.
think that's a good way to show that you know all sides of an argument to the best of your ability that you can.
Totally.
And so when I was writing my PhD, John said to me, make sure to give your PhD to everybody before you submit, because you're going to want to be ripped apart all the time until the last time that you get ripped apart. And so that was really helpful. And what it did is it made me try to strengthen ideas that I was originally quite resistant to being strong parts of my work.
Right.
I think if you can sit and go, I really like this idea, but who hates this idea? Why do they hate this idea? And adding that in instead of going, oh, I hope they don't realize where I was wrong about something.
Mm.
I think that's a really good way to also know if you're ever going to have to debate someone about something or get challenged, that you've covered all the angles.
Mm. With that advice from John to give your thesis to everybody, did you do a similar thing with this book, like giving it out to people to get lots of feedback? And what was that process like?
We gave it out to a lot. We wanted our publisher to um, help us with content editing, which is a lot more money than copy editing of just finding typos. And so
Yeah.
the acquisition person who acquired the book from us, he gave it probably the most thorough read of everyone. And one of the things he found was he said, I love the book, I love the whole thing, but at the end of chapter 1, I'm stuck with the notion, is there a youth mental health crisis? Because he goes, half of it I read and I go, yeah, this is really bad. Then the other half I read and you're kind of saying, but hold on a second, let's pump the brakes. And
Mm.
he said, I think you need to make this really clear. And I love the nuance of letting the reader think about it. But he was so right in the sense that after he gave me this feedback and I read it, I went, oh, we answer this by like chapter 7. We need to move some stuff around and actually make this really clear.
Cool.
And so that was really great. There's also topics like we found in our searches that the younger a child is in their classroom age, right? The more likely they are to be diagnosed with ADHD. So there's a statistically significant finding there. The quick jump there is that teachers stink at working with younger kids in their classroom. Like that's the judgment, where we had to find a way to write that because teachers are arguably the most important profession in the world. Brain surgeons had a teacher, right? Every child on earth should have a teacher. So
You
we
did
want to
it just
say,
then, Will. You inoculated the rebuttal.
yes, exactly. Well, they're going, "Hey, what do you know about a classroom with 13-year-olds? Nothing, right? So we wanted to bring in like, we're not judging. This is just something that we found.
Yeah. In the process of showing that nuance and these different perspectives and arguments, you and Nevin, your co-author, spoke to experts on a range of different topics. And we talk about that in the previous episode content-wise, but it does make me wonder about what that process was like.
Nevin, I think, started that process of talking to people and recording just Zoom interviews, I think to combat my reluctance to dive in quickly to another book. But once I started seeing them, I started thinking to myself, like we interviewed Dr. Sue Johnson, who created emotion-focused therapy. And she unfortunately passed away before the book was finished, which was a real bummer because I think how we've talked about her story I think she'd be really proud with the rebellious spirit that she had. But listening to that interview back over and over, like she grew up in a British pub and she talked about growing up being 6 years old, watching her dad manage a bar. And then there'd be people who have lost their partner after the war sitting at the bar. And she's like, I learned everything about emotions from my father. Like when it's important to hold someone's hand, how to break up a pub fight, how to do all these. And then she talked about when she tried to convince in the 90s psychotherapy to acknowledge emotions and stop being so stuck in cognition. The whole field was like, well, it's typical of a woman that they'd want to talk about emotions. And she's like, big mistake, as if I'm ever going to back down from a fight. So what was interesting, when we started a book, we were never like, yeah, let's talk about this badass woman who takes no shit. And she's a member of the Order of Canada. That's the highest civilian rank in Canada. Like she was unbelievable. And she never took shit. She was APA Family Psychologist of the Year in, I think, 2015. And that stuff, adding in the character, made what they said really come to life. So it was an accidental, really great thing. Talking to the people ended up taking us in different directions. And that, I think, made us really learn and learn different things. And like, I know I spoke last time about environmental toxins. Like, I know Nevin. He lives in Canada. He lives a very healthy, has a greenhouse on his property. I know who Nevin is. I know why environmental toxins could have been of interest. I had no idea what I was about to learn. And it blew me away, where then you start learning about when we talk about what's causing a youth mental health crisis, why is this topic off the radar? Where it's something that we all kind of know, right? And so I think that part, if you're really learning something new, and this is where I think about copying, mimicking other writers, which I'm sure we're going to talk about, a good story is often more important than what that story is really about. Malcolm Gladwell is fantastic at this. Atul Gawande has, the Checklist Manifesto, which we've both read, talks about Boeing and airplanes. Like, I'm a nervous flyer. I should have never read that chapter. It's fantastic.
Oh, yeah, aspects that I never thought I'd be interested in, of fields I didn't think really overlapped. And then you step back and see the cognitive processes, the social processes, the project management that's applicable across the board. And then, as you say, I think this is your main point, the stories of the people behind it. Like, I'm reading about this guy who builds skyscrapers. And I'm like, who is this dude? This guy's
Yeah.
awesome.
And and that's like where I often think, I have a friend, a close friend. We met when Renee and I went to Antarctica. And he's a lawyer in Washington, D.C., and a lawyer in international things, right? I've talked to him before about law. I have no idea what he's talking about. He probably listens to me and goes, I have no idea what Will's talking about. But I often think, I've sat in a hotel room with him once, and he said, "Sorry, I've got to make some work calls." And I said, "Okay." And I'm probably editing. I was grading papers, so I'm grading student papers. I'm sitting there, and he's on the phone like, "If we can really get the Russians on board with this," and I was sitting there going, "Whoa, that's like a Bond movie. Which Russians? Putin? Who's he talking to?" And so I try to be really curious about where someone has an expertise about something that is not really related to my work, and what I can kind of learn from that. And I've had this experience with you in the things we've written, where we've written something, you and I both say, this is perfect, and we send it up the ladder, and it comes back and they say, this is not clear, be very specific with what you're trying to say. And I read it and go, yeah, that's not clear at all. And we need to fix it and just say what we mean. And so I think being around people that you can just learn about what makes them fabulous usually leads to some sort of understanding of how they got to where they are.
Right.
So yeah, I think there's a lot you can learn just from talking to other people, whether it's recorded and it becomes text in your book or not. Like, I think just talking to other people more and more from outside of our bubble is really important.
One of the things that stands out to me in what you're saying is thinking about the threads. As you're pulling on one thread, the other threads that come out, right? Because in academic work, we can be quite structured. We can set a really specific scope to answer a question. Academic papers usually are quite short, and there's a lot of formula involved.
Yeah.
And knowledge translation work can be similar as well. The stuff we've done in that space, like this is a structure we're going to use. This is the level of detail that we'll go into. But when you describe to me talking to all these different experts, you and Nevin having your own expertise, all the literature that you're also reading, that's a lot of content to process, to weave together, to even just the pragmatic aspect of storing this information for later and comparing.
Oh.
Can you talk to that?
So what I actually did a process. Nevin and I, just like you and I in our writing collaborations, we said early on we will never fight about whose project something is, right? And who can be first author or second author. I think that ruins good collaboration with friends. And usually I think most people, if there isn't a weird hierarchy, will know whose project something is. And so that's just being kind with your writing partner. Nevin started the lion's share of the interviews, and then what I started doing was very similar to when I was stuck with my PhD. I knew that we needed a proposal for the book to submit to publishers. So we accidentally made a fake table of contents. And what I did is I took A3 paper and I put a chapter on every wall, and I listened to every interview with sticky notes and just wrote a random quote someone said, and I stuck it somewhere. And then I actually got like string and tied things together to a point. I had a Zoom with one of my friends at it was 1 a.m. in Adelaide. I had a Zoom with a dear friend. She was in North Carolina. And I had lived, when I worked in Alaska, I had lived with her now husband. So we all met at the same time. So I'm talking to my friend, and her husband walks up and goes, when did Will become the Unabomber? Because there was all this thread and stories. And I actually think mapping is really important when you're covering too much. And then simplifying, what are the themes? And so when Nevin said, we're talking about interference, we're talking about trying to help too much, which became intervention. And then we're talking about ideologies of overprotection, safety trap. Young people don't know how to make decisions, like ways of systems of belief. And that was just good alliteration, interference, intervention, ideology. And we went, there's the structure. So interference, phones, the dismantling of the neighborhood, lack of social connection, environmental toxins. There you go. One of the problems with the toxins chapter is we thought this would be something that nobody cares about. And I was like, oh, let's bury it at the end of the book. But it just crept up and up and up and up. And so that became an interesting arc where we're going, there's nothing we can do about a lot of this. You have to protect your children as best you can and make informed decisions the best you can, while also not living in a constant state of anxiety about these things.
Right.
Like, for the most part, we're all probably going to be fine. But it's a topic that's kind of off the table. And so it kept moving up. Yeah. So I think whether they become a book's character or not, really talking with a wide range of people helps to get you outside of your own box, I think.
I like that idea of I'm quite visual myself, and I do a lot of mapping, especially when I'm stuck as well, or it's
Yeah.
it's the start of a project. I like that idea of this topic creeping its way up, or basically like till you can no longer avoid it, I'm here and I'm important. On the flip of that, were there things that you wanted to write about that really became less and less important, or that you had to cut? Like maybe there's not a specific example you have, or we could just talk about the idea of, letting go of ideas that you wanted to keep and what that's like as a writer.
Especially when you're writing with other people, I think many of us know how to use track changes and to write things. And I know some people say don't edit until you're done writing. I like both at the same time. I know that's not conventional, or everyone needs to find their own way. I do think it's really important, especially in a writing partnership, to never be precious about words, because what will happen is you'll end up arguing about what's important, and you'll end up arguing about your perspective on what you've written, where if it's all about the reader, no reader knows what they didn't read. So kind of whenever you're doing a presentation and you say, and you're starting to run out of time, right? And a lot of people say, let me just jump ahead. Why do they need to know that you're jumping ahead? Like, so you can do things instead of going, this has to be here. Let your writing partner delete what's not important. And so I think there are always things that we heard where you're kind of thinking, will the person we interviewed not like being cast in this light? Or maybe this is a controversial topic, something about a mainstream event that they disagree with, or maybe their politics are too far in the present, that maybe we can write it in our own example and not about something else, and not lay that on the expert. But I think if you're not precious about the words you're using, you know that it's a much more collaborative and cooperative writing experience. So trusting that your co-author knows that their opinion about what's good or not good is really helpful. So that's been something I've really benefited from, learning from Nevin, learning from our writing partnership, is trusting that the other person knows how they're reading your words. And so, like, sometimes, for instance, if you tell a joke when you're writing, and I don't think I'm a writing expert, I just love geeking out about it. If you tell a joke, sometimes the joke is there without you telling the reader it's a joke, right? So, like, for instance, we start with a kind of a case vignette about OxyContin, right? Everybody knows this story. In 2020, when all the Netflix specials came out, we all watched them and goes, that's really messed up. Yep, makes sense. Big pharma. And you go, it's a sad story, but it's also so obvious. It's like, oh, we gave everyone legal heroin. Was that smart? Probably not. But then, like, some things that we don't hear in the media today, like Purdue Pharma that created OxyContin, they've rebranded as, I think it's called NOA Pharmaceutical, KNOA. And their mission statement is donating money to combat and you just go, oh, come on. But you don't need to say come on to the person. Like, they get it. If you've told the story well enough, the punchline is there. And so I think that quite often being precious about words ends up leading to not as good of a project, because at the end of the day, if it still is important in your brain, you're going to type it again anyway.
It's a good point. Yeah. And do you think not being precious with that and being happy for, that both of you being able to cut and trim or change helps with it making it sound like it's not obviously written by two people? Like you're not
Yes.
flicking through and it's jumping between voices?
That's another big thing, is when I think our publisher and the acquisition person told us he had never, he could have just been being nice to us. So I don't know. It's jury's out. He said he hadn't read a book written by two people where he cannot find the distinct voice of different people. And I think the reason that is it wasn't like Nevin's going to write about environmental toxins and that's his thing and not my thing for me to learn about. And then I'm going to write about, let's say, the labeling of mental disorders with youth, and that not be Nevin's thing. So if you collaboratively think this isn't mine, this isn't yours, this is ours, I think that's an easy way to write together.
Takes longer though, surely.
Oh, it could take longer, absolutely, especially if you're editing the whole time. But sometimes I think it takes clear communication and telling your co-author, don't touch this chapter till I have an idea and I need the space to do it.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
know?
So the communication is really important.
Yeah, really important. And then, but it can take longer. I do think it's just so important that if you're writing as a team, you're writing to try to find one voice as a team. And so I think that is something that can be hard. And then you have to think of, why are you inviting in the other person that you're inviting in to do this project? So I think it's hard, but I think all of us become better writers learning from other people. I think Nevin is one of the most assertive peer review writers I've ever read, where I try to just mimic Scott Miller's writing, which is to tell a story that shows something that someone else, that they show you a story in a way that gets you to think about what I want you to think about. Similar to Atul Gawande that we brought up with positive deviance and things like that, to tell a story about how I want you to think about this without telling you really what to think. And so you can start going, oh, that kind of makes sense. So I think that stuff can be really important. But yeah, so knowing what your strengths are and then being with someone who complements your strengths is really good.
So you kind of co-create this intellectual baby together, and it has the one voice, which is nice, and actually you've drawn on all these different experts and research in your own experiences as professionals, and then you hand it over to a publisher, and then you start to manage that process. So I want to keep that quite open of any insights you might want to share for people, especially folks who haven't gone through this process yet. What is that like?
Yeah. So handing a book over, it depends on who your publisher is. In academic publishers, they're usually just happy the book is done, and then it will be copy edited, and then it will go out. And it's not too hands-on of a process. It's pretty fast and quick. With a more engaged publisher where their money is on the line of, are we really going to print this thing? And then is anyone going to care? They might be really hands-on. A good rule of this, again, going back to music as a metaphor, I've recorded a lot of music as a drummer, right? You sit down, they've set up and microphoned your drums. You say, yes, that looks like a good microphoning of the drum set. Put on headphones and they start playing a metronome. And then you start playing and they will interrupt you and go, you're off the metronome. Yeah, okay. They go, start again. And you start again. And then you go, I did a great 1 minute and then I went off the metronome. And they go, yep, you're off the metronome, start again. Or then you've recorded all the way through and they go, I think you could do that better. And you go, okay, I guess I'll just do that better. And if you aren't willing to really accept the belief that nobody cares about your intellectual baby as much as you do, it's okay because they're still invested in it going somewhere.
Yeah.
So you have to give away some creative control while maintaining some sort of we're sticking with this point of this topic, you know?
Mm.
So it is hard, the process, and also it's slow. And the hard part of slow is my brain is already on to the next project, but you have to sit with the fact that you know that New Year's 2025, 2026 is around the corner, and we're all going to say, oh, that year flew by. So don't get stuck in the moment. Hand it off and wait for it to come back. Just like peer review, you have to hand it off and go work on something else when you give a study to a journal because you know they're going to be slower than ever.
Yeah. But still increase the frequency rate which you check your emails.
Yeah. Horrible.
Maybe
Horrible.
today.
Maybe. As much as peer review is sort of a broken system at a macro level, a good peer review, just like I was saying about my thesis work, they usually catch things that once it's in print, it's gone. You can't fix it. So
Yeah.
things they catch can be really helpful sometimes. And that gets into a different thing of if you're asked to read something for somebody else, one, don't demand being a co-author, just read it because you're nice to your friends. And two, actually care about what they've written and what they've done and the process they all went through to write something. So I'm a huge believer of I'll help anybody with their writing in the sense of I hope that maybe they'll return that favor or
Mm.
be a phone call away if I'm stuck.
Yes. That community is a really important aspect of anything, but I think especially for writers and for academics or for people thinking about nonfiction. And because I think the reason for that is a lot of what we do can be solo, but
Hmm.
also because we deep dive on stuff. We share a common interest in deep diving on things, but we're not deep diving on the same stuff.
Yeah, totally. And I think my favorite thing I learned about writing is actually the more legwork I do, the more interesting of something I found that hasn't been shared before.
Mm,
And I think that ends up giving me another angle to figure something out.
right.
I know the first time I was on this podcast years ago, you brought up the dodo birds paper and how that was written. And that was me really finding my voice and finding out how to tell a story in a peer reviewed paper. But I think the reason that landed and was received well enough or whatever was because you're talking about how the person that first wrote about bringing an extinct flightless bird into psychotherapy research was because he was the understudy of Skinner and B.F. Skinner, the behaviorist, and saw the fight of behaviorists and psychoanalysts. Where if I just said it's called the dodo bird verdict because
Mm,
you don't tell the story of it. And
mm,
I think that the deeper you dive, the more you find out where terms have come from. I love that Michael White, the late narrative therapy guru, used to say, you know, who here has, you know, relational dynamics? And then you talk about when that word was first used, that term. And it's like, well, no one had relational dynamics before the 1930s because no one talked about it, you know? Or like, for instance, strategic therapy, family systems approaches all emerged during the Cold War where people were moving nukes around. So it's like
mm,
strategery, you know? That's it.
mm,
I think that's the word George Bush used incorrectly. But so if you can find where these ideas came from, it gives you a bit more authority as to why these words are used. And that can be really funny as a way to build
mm,
more knowledge about a topic that's out
mm,
there. So all the therapies have that history. Like, why did Freud want people to lie down? Well, it was Austria at the time was highly a patriarchal world, and people didn't talk about feelings or emotions or their inner world or their unconscious or even all the sexual stuff about your mother or your father and the id, the ego, the superego. So it made sense not to make eye contact with your therapist. But then you get to America, and Americans are typically a little bit more oppositional, and they go, I'm not laying down. We're having a conversation. So it's one of those things where you go, the cultural aspect, all the historical context leads to a bit more understanding about something. And I think doing that legwork will always make for a better writing, something like that.
Mm. It's really awesome, Will. We have not covered all of the things that I would like to cover, but
Mhm.
also you've got other things that you should be able to do today. So
Nothing.
I think that's a good space to wrap it up. And before we do, though, I'm wondering if you might have just any other things you're like, no, actually, I just really want to mention this before we finish, or if you're feeling content.
No, one thing, and please tell me to shut up if this goes too far into a tangent. I went to boarding school in Massachusetts. And I remember, I think it was my junior year, so year 11, we went and visited Henry David Thoreau's, the remake of his Cabin and Walden Pond. And I couldn't read Thoreau. It was too wordy. And I just had the most wonderful teacher who was talking about how she built a cabin in her backyard in Massachusetts and wanted to do all this stuff. And I always remember the quote from Thoreau that when I finally really read it and started to understand what he was saying. And Thoreau said, if I can drive life into into a corner, this is paraphrasing, maybe I'll understand what it means to really be alive. And I think if you can get passionate about something that's really small and you can drive that into a corner, you'll make it big for everybody else. So if you look at best-selling books, Atomic Habits, Checklist Manifesto, you don't need to read the Checklist Manifesto to understand what this book is going to tell you, right? So I think that's the same thing with research. People try to stay way too global and big. This will solve therapy forever. Find something tiny and really drive into it and figure it out. And then that actually will lead to learning things about, just like notions of like learning about toxins or learning really more of the story about OxyContin is much more fascinating than just going, the pharmaceutical industry is messed up. Everyone knows that. But going really deep into something and getting it really in there, I think that ends up helping a lot of people to tell a story from different angles. If you're ever reading something and someone says, I know we talked about, like, for instance, last time, the phones are causing a youth mental health crisis, right? Go read something from the 1980s, and what you'll find is they were all talking the exact same way. And then you have a good critique of it. So I think if you can drive something into a corner and really sit there with it, you'll learn so much more than you anticipated. And that will give you some good ammunition to bolden your writing. The last thing I would say is reading and reading your favorite authors is a really good idea. But also, everyone has different accessibility to the written word. So if you're an audiobook person, if you're a podcast person, if you're a reader, if you're a journaler, if you're watching movies, you can always take clever lines that people say and learn how to use them in your own way. So what I started doing was, if I'm listening to podcasts, I just have a pad of paper next to me. And so, for instance, one person said on a podcast, blah, 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 this is the alphabet soup. And I forget exactly what they were talking about, but some fancy acronym about something. And I thought, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, borderline personality disorder, BPD, PHQ-9, the patient health questionnaire 9. And I went, actually, our field is an alphabet soup too. And so it gives you little creative things to go, that was super clever, and I like that term, and I'll be taking that. So you can take those, I think they're idioms or colloquials, and that helps you to be evocative and illustrative of your point a bit more. And don't worry about pleasing square science academic rigor. Like, write your voice, and don't worry, like, you can still have fun with sharing your perspective, and you don't have to worry about coming across like you're the smartest person in the room. The best room you'll ever be in is when you're the dumbest person in the room, because then you'll learn everything from people.
Yeah.
So those are just things that I always think about when thinking about writing in general, of which I'm a lifelong learner, and I don't think I've got it.
Awesome tips to finish on. Like, it's actually really nice, kind of wholesome and like lovely motivational call at the end. Appreciate that, Will. I think that we better round out the episode by you talking about where people can access your latest book, Kids These Days. It's currently on pre-sale.
So we have a website, kidsthesedaysbook.com. Of course, there's like all book titles. There's probably like 1,000 Kids These Days books. But kidsthesedaysbook.com is a place not only to go and find places to purchase the book if that's your interest. At the same time, I sit with the mantra of share everything. And so our whole reference list is there. We have a whole resources packet, which has the abstracts of those references, where you can find them, the links to that, so you can make up your own mind about what we included in the book. You can get to know the experts we interviewed. There will be podcast content. Nevin has a good Substack called Adults in the Room, which is, of course, the play that we're not really crapping on the kids. It's much more about us as the adults and how we can step up. And so that is a place that I know some people don't like reading books, don't want to pay an academic for their book, even though we're not getting rich off a book unless all of you buy it. But I think what's really important is just that that information is shared widely. So there's a lot there. There's tons of links to other things that you can find from different thinkers. There's controversy and debate, and maybe the whole idea is to inspire people to think about what's going on in the current socio-political environmental context that we live. Not to tell you to agree with us or anything like that. So that's a good place to start. You can also, if you're interested in outdoor therapy stuff, there's outdoortherapycenter.com, which is not, there's no money to be made out of that project. And that is center spelled the British Australian way, CENTR. But that has dozens of hours of free presentations. It's got one from you from Social Sciences Week about nature-based and risky play in childhood. That's another good place where if you just want to have free content to go through and no one's taking a credit card, there's no mailing list there, stuff like that. So Amazon, anywhere you get your books, all that stuff is out there, and most of it's free and accessible for the most part. So that would be a cool place to go if that's of interest to you. There is a sign up on the kidsthesedaysbook.com. That's not a mailing list. We're not messaging you every week or telling you that Nevin wrote a new Substack or Will was on a podcast. That's just only important things related to the book. So no spam there if you want to register for that as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Will. Thanks for coming in. Doing that kind of rare thing that we don't get to do very much was talk about the processes behind what we create. And yeah, on you mentioning the websites and the various content that you create, you do a really excellent job of bringing people together and sharing ideas in a really open way without hiding it behind a paywall or making it unnecessarily complicated or siloed. So thanks. Always a pleasure.
I think that one thing, and this is just my last door handle conversation, I think that it's really important that we really focus. I mean, I'm from the United States. I grew up in Washington, D.C. I've worked in red states, blue states. I've worked in indigenous communities in Australia and North America. I actually think the most important human quality is to bring people together and allow their opinion of what we've done, what anyone has done, to rule the roost. That will help us all find where we all settle. And if we become tribalized by politics or our profession, we're not going to do the best for kids these days, because we're going to silo them away where we should really be entering their worldview, their cultural experience, and bring everyone together to make up our minds about what we think as individuals and in the communities that we live.
Heck yeah.
Now I'll shut up.
Thank you, Will.